You can all start to migrate back towards your seats. Hopefully you've made at least 3 new friends. Okay, so how many of you connected with somebody whose idea of what a design system is different than yours? Oh yeah, and how many of you connected with people who had like the exact same understanding? So if you, so more people different than similar. So this will be interesting. All right. So first, I'd like to give a shout out to DoorDash and to Ryan for hosting and presenting and having us here. DoorDash is also a Khosla Ventures portfolio company. I've worked with first Josh Abrams, who is the VP of Design, and then Albert for a long time. And I'm so pleased that they were able to host because they have had this nice focus on design from the very beginning. Hopefully you have had a chance to appreciate the experience wall here. This is work that James Buckhouse over at Sequoia Ventures did with when Josh was here, I think. But it's a nice way to do some journey mapping, user experience mapping across all the different user types, across different phases and stages. But I also love how the brand values are kind of front and center and prominent. So, and nice inspiration for those of us who are thinking about how to build design culture within companies. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to take it away and hand it over to Ryan, who's going to lead us through kind of how DoorDash has developed and designed and deployed their design systems. And then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So.
Thank you, Irene. Awesome. So before we get started, I just wanted to put up a really quick disclaimer on this. DoorDash is a growth stage company. We have a lot of engineers compared to our designers. We have like 115 engineers and 5 designers. So the sort of things that we did to build our design system and the path that we took may or may not necessarily be applicable to what you're doing. So just you know, quick disclaimer on that side. So let's get started. Hello, this is Lessons on Design Systems. Basically, I'm gonna just go through some of the things that we learned over the last year that I've been working on this. I'm a design technologist here at DoorDash, and basically for us, what that means is I'm an engineer and a designer that is focused on building design systems, design infrastructure, and tools that help us build better products. So just a quick overview of what DoorDash is. We're a last mile logistics company, and that's a fancy way for me to say, you know, we want to power every single delivery in a city. And right now we're focused on food, but we're moving into spaces like grocery delivery and other things. And today, what we're going to talk about is, I'm going to first sort of define what design systems are in general, that in the way that most people think of them, as well as what are design systems for DoorDash. I'm going to talk about some of the problems that we face along the way that we think most people are going to encounter when they try to build their own design system. And then we're going to talk about what we learned along the way. So what are design systems? As Irene said earlier, everyone probably has a different definition for it. But there's a definition that a great designer and writer named Nathan Curtis defined as a design system offers a library of visual styles, components, and other concerns that are documented so that adopting products can be more efficient and cohesive. And they're usually built as things like code or design tools. For us at DoorDash, there's a little more of what a design system is than just this. There's a quote by Jeff Bezos that I think is really applicable to design systems. Good intentions never work. You need good mechanisms to make that happen. And for us, you know, to really capture how this applies to what we're trying to solve with our design systems, I would put it a little more like this. Good intentions alone never work at scale or in the long term. You need good mechanisms to make anything happen with consistent quality and speed. So this says a few things, right? You need good intentions. That has to be sort of the baseline. You need a team that has the skill and the will to really build great products. And you use design systems to continually translate those good intentions into really great work. And that's particularly true if you have a lot of people involved or a product is long-lived. You need a way to actually support that intent and to make really great work. So the mission of design systems at DoorDash is, we provide the infrastructure and process to help product design and develop and produce really high quality work with speed and at scale. And that means we're responsible for building a culture that really values a design system, has the process and communication to make that work and to build that out. And we also are responsible for building the mechanisms that support that culture. All the tools and the components and all the style guides that people think are a design system by itself. For us, it's just half of sort of what we think design systems are. So when I talk about scale and speed and quality, what does that really mean? For us, quality means a few things. It means at the end of the day that whatever we build has to produce better products for our end customers. So consumers, merchants, and dashers who do the deliveries. We have to make sure that even though design systems are sort of seen as a way of producing efficiency for ourselves internally, the work that we actually put into it benefits our customers at the end of the day. Secondly, it means being consistent where consistency makes sense. I think design systems are generally thought of primarily as a way to help things be as consistent as possible. But for us, we have to be really cognizant of, there are a lot of places where you can be consistent, where you can reuse solutions that you've done before. But you also have to make sure that the design system helps you understand where breaking that consistency makes more sense for your end goal, building the products that you're building. And then finally, it means freeing product design to focus on the things that matter for the project that they're working on, right now. So, if you have a good solution to a series of like micro UX problems, if the constraints of the problem that you're solving don't change between projects, you should reuse that solution as much as possible. And you should focus on the things that are inherently different in what you're solving versus spending your time on the things that you could reuse. When I talk about scale, a lot of design systems that are built at companies like Lyft or Dropbox or Airbnb are primarily focused on helping really large design teams, teams of like 50 or 100 designers, be internally consistent. But for us, the scale that we need to tackle is more about making a really small design team relative to our engineering and product counterparts as high leverage as possible. The goal is, if we can make every designer that has to work with a team of 10 engineers and 1 or 2 product designers as efficient as possible so that they can focus on the work, that's the sort of thing that we want to solve for. And another part of it is, because we have a lot of engineers, we want to make sure that they're empowered to do good design and UI engineering work. So how do we make those engineers more efficient? How do we make the work that you have one engineer doing more consistent with the work another engineer is doing? And finally, scale is also for us about how do we serve 3 major audiences: our consumers, our merchants, and our dashers. And how do we also build for other products that are very different? Things like our platform product like DoorDash Drive, all the internal tools that we use to actually run our delivery network. And for all of those audiences and all of those products, we may have 2 or 3 different platforms that we also need to build for. So how do we make sure that the work that we're doing designing can be applied across all those platforms. So, those are sort of the problems that we were trying to solve for. And, our approach was this. On a high level, we just need to share solutions when constraints haven't changed. We need to think about design in a way that can be done in layers, that can be done independently, so that I could work on one solution that can translate across different products and different projects. In the middle, we think about building process and culture. So we need to build sort of a team that cares about saving and sharing decisions and has really open communication so that the design decisions that we make can be saved and revisited and reconsidered because all the context is there as we're making those decisions. And then the fun stuff, we build components, style guides, and design tools to actually support all that stuff. And the thing that I really don't want to understate is Ethan Marcotte once said is creating a pattern library is great, but getting an organization to actually adopt it and then actually invest and maintain it over time, that is the real work, and that is something that we learned in spades as we were sort of building out our design system here. So, what were the actual problems we encountered along the way? We needed to figure out how do we actually build this thing incrementally. You're never gonna be able to build the one system that you can release all at once at the very beginning and just have it work from then on out. You have to be able to take a design system, especially at sort of the scale of DoorDash, to take it incrementally and do it in a way that you can sort of build on over time. The other big challenge that we went through was how do you actually get an organization to adopt a design system? There are a lot of people, there are a lot of teams, there are a lot of projects at any one time. And to convince all of them to adopt a design system and changing fundamentally how they work is really, really difficult and probably the thing we learned most about. And for us, the key sort of lesson is like, how do we build trust? How do we get people to think that this is worthwhile to actually adopt? Similarly, once we had a design system, we knew that it couldn't just stay stagnant. We needed to figure out how to actually make it designed in such a way that we could change it over time, and then we could bring good decisions that we've made to all the people that have already adopted the design system, so they can make use of that. So this is some of the stuff that we learned along the way. And just as an overview, for learning what we needed to build incrementally, we started off with one platform, we started off with one team, and we dove really deeply to learn all that we needed to understand how to build and manage a design system from the ground up. And we started really small by focusing on a core foundation of our typography, our color system, and our spacing system, and then use those things to build up into more and more complex components. So this was a philosophy. We built on web one place. We uncovered as many constraints as we could, and then we generalized that for wider use. The web was our testing ground. I've been a web engineer and a designer for my entire career, and I had been one of the first front engineers here at DoorDash, and there was a lot of trust sort of built in because of how embedded I was and close to the web team I was. So when I was trying to figure out how I could actually tackle a design system, the web seemed like a really natural choice. I could work in a space where I could move fast because I knew how to implement things. I was really connected to the team, and I had a lot of context on sort of what our design was. I had a lot of context on what our code bases were. So I could really focus on learning the things that I didn't already know by working on the web. And the way that we started actually building it was we built foundations first. We took typography, color, and spacing, and then we built those things up into more complex components, like even simple ones like button systems, icons, overlays, cards, etc. We used our foundation to build those things, and then used those simple components to build things that were more complex, things like modals and navigation bars, etc. And the way that we approached actually building this was we built our components in React. We had documentation in this tool called Storybook, which allowed us to play with our React components. And we built design assets for both Sketch and Figma. And we took our existing sort of designs from our consumer application, found the best parts of that, and then brought it into the design system in a more codified way. For typography, the first thing that I did to build the system was I figured out what we wanted to do with type. I took like specifications for all the sizes and the different line heights, color pairings that we expected to use, and figured out how to communicate and guide people on how they would actually apply it in their work. And we built our components in a couple of ways so that it could be accessible both on the design side as a shared like Figma component, as well as our React component, so that engineers had a really direct like connection between the actual design and the components that they're using. Another sort of aspect that we figured out as we were tackling our type was we wanted to make sure that this was a design language system. And what I mean by that is the biggest overhead that you can have with a design system is making sure that the way that you're communicating with a designer or an engineer is as clear and direct as possible. So for instance, when we were designing what our components were, we made sure that the way that we talked about them and the way that we configured them was the same both on the design side as well as the engineering side. We wanted to make our work as direct and one-to-one as possible. And for us, this is a big sort of principle on how we build our design system and components. We took our existing color palette and sort of the massive set of one-offs and odd colors that sort of slipped in on our web products. And we figured out what are the use cases that those things are actually being used for. What are the colors that we could potentially shift them to, and could we actually, with our real and sort of specified brand palette, accommodate all the use cases that we are already sort of using one-off colors for. And we went through the process of just shifting over and making sure that we don't have all these extraneous colors. And that was a big part of how we cleaned up our color system. Another part of our design system that I think was interesting in the color realm was we took this idea of having a base palette of all of our colors in the brand. So you could have like all of our reds, so like red 1, red 2, red 3. And then we also had this layer of, how do you actually apply that? What colors do we actually use for our primary actions or the primary actions that are just text links? So what we did was we mapped the brand like color name to an actual use case. So say I said like red 3 is the color that we should be using for all our primary actions. And we did that for a bunch of different use cases, and we're doing that for a bunch of use cases for, say, our mobile apps. And we wanted to make this layer of abstraction a way for us to update and be able to change the system moving forward, in the sense that if we have all these colors that are being used that are just like use case specific, if we ever want to change what our primary action color is, for instance, I can change that in one place, and all the other components that are using that concept will just automatically get that design decision delivered to them, rather than us having to go and find where all of the red colors are being used and understanding the context that they're used in, and then trying to make a decision at the place where it was used to say, oh, we should change it to the new sort of primary action. We also stole another really great idea from Nathan Curtis of how we think about spacing. The way that we decided we wanted to handle spacing was we wanted to have 3 concepts for how spacing and layout would work. We would have this idea of an inset, which is just spacing that is on all sides. Like if you know CSS, you can imagine padding on all sides. We had this concept of a stack, which is basically spacing that occurs vertically. And we also had this concept of an inset, or an inline that has spacing that is used horizontally. And we tied all 3 of those concepts to both React components as well as how we thought about our designs. So if you do your design with this set of concepts in mind, it's very easy for us to translate that to our engineering, because you're just using the exact same sort of spacing concepts that is also tied to a specific scale of sizes that are available to you. So for us, we chose a scale that was sort of on a 4-point grid, and just made it wide enough that we would never have to change that spacing scale ever again. And hands down, this was the most welcome and surprisingly powerful thing that we did. It changed fundamentally how our web engineers built our products. Every single layout that we build now uses these 3 concepts in a very fundamental way. And it's something that I've heard continual praise from engineers about. So, how do we get adoption, right? This is the hardest work of the design system. And I think the thing that is interesting is whenever you try to tell someone how to change how they work, that is a recipe for disaster unless you approach it in a really open and sort of calm way. And there are a lot of really good reasons why people have opinions on how they should be working. So we had to do a lot of legwork to actually take people from a place of how they were working to how they are working now with the design system. Again, like if the teams that you're trying to engage with on a design system don't trust it, then there's no point. There's no point in building a design system. And the reason is, the goal of the system is coordinating people. It's about getting people to think about design in a different way. And for us, if we couldn't get that trust, it wasn't worth it at all. So one of the things that I learned over the way was, like I said, I've been really embedded in the web team for a long time, and there was a lot of trust there. But even in that world, there were moments where I had to really do a lot of work to make sure that the people that were going to be using the design system trusted it enough. And one instance here is I basically made a proposal. We're going to change how we write CSS. We're going to do it in a way called styled components. And it wasn't something that I could just decide on my own. It wasn't something I could just sort of say by fiat, like, this is how we're going to do things now. Sorry. But what I had to do was, take that idea that we were going to build a design system with this new way of building CSS. And I had to, go in, build small prototypes. I tried to sort of give an understanding of how would you actually start building something new with this new way of building with CSS? And how do you actually take existing code and convert it into this new way of building CSS? I had to write guidelines for how folks could use this thing successfully. And through all that sort of legwork and background work, I was able to work with a team to make sure that, oh, okay, this decision is sound. This thing that you're trying to do, we trust. And because of that, like the ability for them to adopt and start using the design system was not encumbered at all by this technical decision. About a month ago, I started building out our design system for iOS. And the thing, the thing that I discovered and I realized super early on was I am not an iOS engineer. I have no experience in that. And to go into that world and that team to actually try to move this initiative forward, I needed to make sure that I had all the context that I needed to work with them. I needed to make sure that I wasn't just this web engineer or designer that was sneaking into their code bases and telling them how to do things. I had to make sure that they saw me as a part of the team. So I started going to their weekly meetups. I started reviewing code. I tried to understand all the context that they had around how they did their work right now, and what are the problems they have that manifests as inconsistencies in design or slower implementation of design. And I tried to do all of that before ever going in and try to fix anything. And to me, this applies to not just engineering. This applies to design. So imagine you're trying to get a design system adopted, but you go to a different product team and you don't have all the context for why why their product design is the way it is. It's up to you as sort of the champion of the design system to go in there, understand the context, work with them to really solve their problems before ever sort of trying to impose anything of your own. Another thing that we realized when trying to get adoption was, we have so many implicit design decisions that just happen and are never saved. We have principles that we sort of know implicitly, but it's not written down in a place that you can look at and examine and re-examine. So for us, one of the things that I really wanted to do was build a culture on a team that made sure that we documented this stuff, made sure we could come back to it. And one example of how we sort of thought through that was I started driving this project to get our principles written down. And basically, I just asked Albert, our head of design, be like, how do we think about this? What is our sort of stance on things like, what is accessibility at DoorDash? What are sort of, what's the way that we think about how we design for multiple platforms? How do we want to design for consumers or merchants or dashers? And for me, trying to make sure that we had some of that stuff considered and written down was super important. And the thing that I want to say is I didn't write any of that stuff. I think my goal there was I want us to be more thoughtful about making sure that we're explicit about it, even if I'm not necessarily the person that's defining those things. And it was useful in the sense that we got a few folks looking at these documents and sort of defining for our team what these things were. And then another part of making sure people can use and adopt a system is putting the right documentation in the right place. So if we had documentation for, say, our web components in a place that an engineer would never ever think of looking, there's the chance of them being successful with the design system is close to zero. And for us, making sure we had the documentation that could be easily accessed by the people who needed it and had the right sort of constraints was super important that we learned over time. So how do you actually design for change? Once you've built something, how do you actually make sure that you can update and change the decisions that you've made over time through a design system? One of the things we learned was we needed to really find a balance between being flexible and being rigid. So what you're looking at right now is on the left is our existing type system, and on the right is a new type system that I've been working on. And the thing that we found was initially I was really rigid on what exact levels of the type system there was. You could only change things like the size and the color, and that was it. And especially as we were going through a phase where we were rebranding our app and sort of our products in general, we needed to be able to experiment a little more. We needed to have a little more flexibility, especially with a component that is as fundamental as your typography. And the thing that's interesting is, you know, this also applies to the more complex things. So we have a modal component, and there are a lot of things that should never ever change about a modal, especially around things like accessibility. And we want those things to always be specified and provided by the design system. But there are also things that we want to make sure that are flexible enough for the use cases that we know people are going to be using this thing for. We know people are going to want to have like a different header or a different footer, and that should be like, you should be able to do that, and we should be able to provide a default that is, you know, is consistent with the design system and easy to use for most cases, but still providing the flexibility when we need to for new things that I would never anticipate. Another part about making sure that you can design a system for change is being really persistent about over communication. If I change something and I don't actually communicate well to the teams that are using this thing, they're never going to adopt it unless they just happen to be working on a new project, right? So for me, I spend a lot of my time working with individual teams and engineers to make sure if I have a change that's going out on the design system, they know that like it's out there, and this is sort of the way that you get to the next step of adopting it. Another thing that we learned was, you know, we have to be okay with teams adopting this thing incrementally. We're never going to have every single team using this thing from the get-go, and we're never going to have every single update that we make to the system immediately be used by every single team. There are a lot of things that that is okay for. There are other things like being like doing a rebrand, for instance, where you have to be more involved and work with each of the teams individually to make sure that they have, you know, done the work to update to the new version of the system. But for us, we have to be okay with these things going out in piecemeal. Otherwise, people just won't use the system. And sort of a similar version of that on like the design side is we have to make it really easy to use the system, because if we had a design system that was too rigid, and you, for instance, were using it in Sketch or in Figma, and it didn't necessarily allow you to do what you needed to solve your product design problem, it's really easy for someone to just disconnect that component instance or that symbol from the actual shared design library. And then at that point, they're never going to be able to easily update that design with updates to the system because it's been disconnected. So for us, we needed to make sure that when we were figuring out what design tools we use, like between Sketch or Figma, we opted for flexibility in a way that allowed people to still work with the system rather than just opting out and never, you know, being able to get the changes that come through it. And then finally, one of the things that we want to do is we want to share as much as possible between our tools. There's this concept of design tokens from Salesforce that talks about design decisions as things that you save in a format that can be used across all of your products and platforms. So for us, that means we have a place where we're saving things like color and typography and spacing in a format that we can then turn into iOS code, or we could turn into Android code or React code. And for us, having sort of one source of truth to what our design system is, and making it really easy to turn that into whatever we need for all of our platforms is a really powerful idea that we're trying to invest in. And similarly, there's a tool that I work on the side called Lona that basically allows that same idea to work for components. So you design a component in like a desktop design tool, and then you can turn that into Swift code or Android code or React code. And I think moving forward, there's a lot of tools and a lot of thinking that's similar to this that can be used to make your design system super efficient. So just in summary, what we learned was we needed to build incrementally. We needed to build from foundations first, and then compose those things up into more complex components. We needed to really value people and culture over process and components and all the things that are fun and exciting about a design system. And we also just needed to build with change in mind. This is supposed to be a project that lives on throughout, whatever era of design at DoorDash we are going to be in, and it has to be something that can change over time. So basically, what's next for us? We're focused right now on going to mobile. About 80% of my time is spent working on our new iOS framework and collaborating with folks like Ben and Sam on our design team to make our design system on mobile work for some of the redesign work that we're currently working on. We're also really investing in using design tokens to make that sync between web, iOS, and Android so that we can build those things in tandem in a really efficient and fast way. And then finally, we're looking to build a team. So trying to get more people that are working on design systems, both on the engineering and design side. Anyway, thank you. And I think we have about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A if anyone has questions. Yeah.
So can you talk about a little bit more about on the design side as well as on the engineering side?
So just to repeat the question, how did you actually maintain and continue developing the design system on the engineering and design side? So basically, I'm sort of, at least for the web stuff, I'm basically a team of one in the sense that if there's changes to the design system or things that need to be updated, I'll probably hear about it from someone on the design team, and then I will go in, try to solve that problem on the design side, and then go into the design system like web repo and update that myself. And generally it's been like that, but the idea is we want more people both on the design and engineering side to be able to contribute directly to the system.
A lot of companies, I feel like, that it's too early to start creating because it's changed rapidly. So what's your take on the time to start?
I think it depends in the sense that if you're a 2 or 3 person company and you're trying to find product market fit and you need to build change very deeply into what you're doing, it might not be a great time to start a design system. And I think the thing that, the place where it makes most sense to start doing this is when you start hitting up against the limits of being able to just work with a small team. And when you start getting to team sizes that are like much bigger than like a 2 or 3 person startup. So like if you can imagine the 10 person to 1 design or 10 engineer to 1 designer ratio that we have, I would imagine like around the 6 or 7 mark, that's sort of the place where you get more inefficiencies, and it might make sense to start investing in like a design system. Oh, thanks.
Better? Oh, there you go.
Awesome.
How when you started, was there a team that you guys had built initially saying we want to do this, and then you pitched it to leadership, or was it something that like you personally or somebody like started as a pet project and then it turned into a snowball?
It was more of a pet project situation in the sense that I've been sort of doing some small version of the design system for web for a while. But being able to work on it full time was more of a process of me sort of working with my boss at the time, who was the previous head of design, and really sort of making him understand sort of what my capabilities were and what the use of the design system would be, especially as we were starting to grow.
Bring the mic.
So I'm kind of curious, what was the state of all the different, I guess on the engineering side before you actually started the design system? And then sort of as you were going through those first steps, like how much did you actually have to deal with sort of the legacy stuff, right? It's like, oh, we're changing all our fonts or our spacing or our colors, and then actually going through the rest of, you know, starting with a web team, going through all the code and actually changing it, or did you just do it sort of incrementally like that as well?
We're still dealing with legacy stuff right now. Part of the reason why I think incremental was important was, for instance, our consumer site right now is in the process of going through a major sort of technical refactor. And it was a place where we couldn't necessarily adopt the design system immediately. But there are other places like our for business site and our Drive platform that could start actually using those things as immediately as possible. So it really depended on the state of those code bases, and there are plans for every single one of them to migrate to the design system, but it's something that I couldn't just say we were going to start doing. I had to work with those teams to make sure, you know, it was in a good place.
And actually in that kind of a case, so it sounded like what you had done is you did a lot of good documentation, you're publishing these components. At that point, is it literally like, okay, you know, some team, now you have to put it on your roadmap or something like that. Instead of building features, you have to go out and like, you know, replace all your existing stuff with a design system, or?
I think for a big part of it was there were actually a couple of new products that we were building at the right time for the design system to be used from the start. So that was super helpful. One of the things that I'm working on right now is sort of figuring out with our consumer web team to make sure that as we do that technical refactor and migrate this existing code base to a new stack, how do we make sure that the design system integration happens alongside that? And a big part of it is, you know, since we moved to a new way of writing CSS, that's actually a big driver for them to say, oh, if we're moving to this new version of how we write CSS, might as well start using the design system. So there's a lot of sort of background work around working with the teams, making sure that it's on their roadmap, as well as just finding the right places where, say, a new product can start benefiting from this immediately.
Hi.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen design systems help engineering with speed?
So I think primarily the thing that has been most interesting for us on the speed side is because the design system was primarily built to like help engineers be more efficient on the website initially. It's been super impactful just on their workflow, both in terms of efficiency, in terms of the quality of the work, as well as the consistency that we're seeing. So I would say it's definitely been successful on, you know, making them more efficient, making them more consistent.
Hi, I'm just curious about when you designed the design system, and do you start from scratch, or you are getting some inspirations from anywhere that, like Google has their design system and Airbnb has their own. So do you take a look at those as an inspiration? Where's the reference?
Yeah, I think the thing that's actually interesting about where we drew inspiration from was not necessarily the way that the system was designed, in the sense of, we're gonna steal the type levels from like Google, but it was more about what are some of the problems that they're solving around like how they document their work. Like, how can we build something that is as useful as that for our system? And if they do have really good sort of design decisions, we're going to take a look at it. But for us, it's more about starting from our problems and making sure that we're solving from first principles in that sense.
Question about mechanisms you mentioned. I can imagine on the engineering side, the mechanisms like you mentioned, like components and common style sheets and things like this. But how about on the design side? What kind of mechanisms did you find for designers that work with their tools?
I think for us, it's still sort of an ongoing process, in the sense that we've tried shared sketch libraries. We've tried things like Lingo, which is another way to share sketch components. We're currently trying to migrate to Figma, which we've sort of seen as both a really great collaboration platform, because you can have multiple designers working one file at any one time, as well as a place where you can have components that are flexible enough to accommodate whatever design work you're doing, but also still like give as many of the good design decisions in the system to the particular design project that you're working on. So for us, it was a lot of trial and error, a lot of like piloting, and we're still in the process of trying to migrate over to something that makes sense on the design side.
At what level does your style guide need to be, or how concrete your style guide needs to be before you can start with a design system?
I think you could just do your type guidelines, and that would be a great start, in the sense that I think a big sort of chunk of the value that you get out of the design system is going to come from the fundamentals. And as soon as you can get that in a really good place, and you can make that consistent across design and engineering, that is going to be a big step.
Designers are very creative people, obviously. So how do you prevent design mutiny, where somebody thinks, oh, this should just be a little bit different, or changing styles here and there?
I think the big lesson there is to listen to what they're saying. And what I mean is, if there's a use case that doesn't quite fit in what the design system is trying to solve, and if there's a place where you feel this suboptimal feeling, there's probably something that you can incorporate back into the design system because of that feeling that you have that it's not quite right. And to me, it's really about working with everyone to make sure that their concerns are addressed, and coming to a resolution where, here's the trade-offs of changing it, here's the trade-offs of keeping it. Let's figure out, does it actually make sense for us to try to, change it system-wide? And if it does, we should change it.
I should have asked this as a follow-up to my last one, but how did you guys, or did you kind of tackle any of the content around things like guidelines for either designers or developers in terms of usage, behavior, like any other ways that you can describe how something should be used, or providing some feedback around like do's and don'ts, that stuff?
I think for us, we have some of that guidance, but it's not as fleshed out as it could be. And I think a lot of the documentation that we do have is sort of more on the functional side of, okay, this is all the capabilities of this thing, and this is how you can use it. But there's only a smaller portion of, how do you actually apply it
Tell us some ugly stories, like where it didn't work or where you ran into a culture issue, like challenges.
So I think let me think. There is one component that I started building called, like, it was this pagination component. And basically, it's this series of like little oval pills that allow you to know like sort of what page you're on, right? And there's this really fancy design by this guy that like was incredibly difficult. And I literally spent like a week on it and I couldn't make it work. And I just like made it as simple as possible. I was like, I will never again make a fancy animation for this guy. So I still love you.
Thanks, first of all, for your presentation. That was great. How did you reconcile differences in the design language, you know, based on what already existed? Like, who made the call on what was to go into the system?
To be honest, it was sort of ragtag. I basically just made calls and would involve people like when I needed some feedback. And it wasn't really a committee. It was more like, okay, this is sort of how I think things should move. And like, if I'm unsure about something, I'm just gonna try to get, you know, a couple more people involved and taking a look at it.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about the internal tool that you said you were building. What is it called?
So the
Luna?
So this is sort of a side project that I've been doing outside of DoorDash, but I'm interested in bringing it into our workflow. It's called Lona. It's primarily by a friend of mine at Airbnb, but I help out every now and then. And it's just a desktop design tool that you can use to build components that can translate to all of the platforms.
So how is that different from, I don't know, Zeppelin or Figma or? So
the sort of code that you get out of tools like Zeppelin and Figma is very limited in the sense that you can't specify all of the parameters of how a layout should work as precisely as you can in like code or in a tool like Lona. And sort of what you get out of those design tools are generally just visuals only versus a tool that allows you to specify, you know, this is how it interacts, this is how the layout actually works under the hood in a way that's as simple as Lona does.
If you can restart this project again, what are the top 3 things that you would do differently?
If I could restart it, I think the biggest thing that I realize is that for us, a lot of the really high impact projects are on mobile. And like with the if I could go back in time but still have all the knowledge that I've accumulated, I would like try to tackle mobile first because it's really high impact and there's a lot more sort of surface area for mobile products here. But I don't think I would do it if I didn't already sort of have the knowledge that I had like doing web first.
So you talked about how you start with the web and then go into iOS team and Android team. So does that mean you maintain the same component library, but just trying to make it responsive to different platform? Or when you move on to like iOS as a platform, you'll start a complete different library?
So technically the libraries are different, but the things that we're trying to make sure we keep in sync are like the fundamentals, the things that we would share with a tool like design tokens. And we're trying to share as much as possible in that, as well as, for instance, like a button, right? Especially between mobile web and iOS and Android, there's a lot of consistency there. And we want to make sure that those sort of things also are shared. For more complex things like modal, like potentially modals, etc., it might be different, like implementations. But in general, we want to share as much as possible, but there are going to be different things on different platforms, depending on the context.
Hey, so follow up with the previous question. So what is the most proud stuff that you did for design system?
So there's this post that I wrote on Medium a few months ago about all the weird and crazy things that I learned about how to build a modal. And it sounds so boring because it's a modal, right? But there are a lot of considerations that like I had to sort of stumble my way through when building this thing for web. And there are a lot of particulars around like accessibility, for instance, that I think we captured really nicely in our like modal component for web. So for me, that might be like the highlight of it.
Thank you.
Hi. So I have a question. So with like web, you have responsive designs, and then with iOS and Android, you obviously have different device sizes. And I'm assuming your components are, responsive and everything. I guess I was wondering on the design side, like for example, if you're using Sketch, like it's the same component, but you have to design it for the, like, I guess I'm just wondering how you guys manage to, or like, do you have the same components that have the same names? Then, like, I don't know, like how do you do it from the design side?
Yeah, so for instance, like the modal is a responsive component that we built. And basically in the shared like Figma library that we have, I have different versions of that modal at different sort of device widths. And like if you're designing for like mobile web, then you should pull that component. But the thing that I think is interesting and important is that like if you're ever using a modal, it might, and you know its capabilities, what you could do is just design it at whatever sort of size makes sense. And because the modal has been designed to work at different sizes, it's easy for you to just design it in sort of one screen size and then know it's going to work on the other screen sizes if you are sort of living within the bounds of what its capabilities are. So it actually potentially like saves some work because you don't necessarily have to go through the process of seeing how it looks on every single device size.
So you had mentioned when you were starting out, one of the most important things is building trust and getting people to actually buy into this idea of making these big changes and everything. Now that you actually have built the design system, it seems like there's evidence that engineers are more efficient and things like that. Is DoorDash now in a position where it's like design system first, we're building a new feature, component, like it's got to go through this, everybody's sort of centered on this, or is it still kind of, work in progress? Or
I think we're making our way towards that world in the sense that, for instance, one of the big high impact projects that we're working on around redesigning our consumer iOS app is like centered around making sure that, as we change a big chunk of our consumer app, it's being designed with the help of a design system. And so while it's not necessarily something that we've applied everywhere, I think we're making steps to, have design systems be a really core part of both the design and engineering process.
It seems you work a lot on your in your individual time on design system. I wonder whether or not this creation is also a design team collaborative process, and if it is, and like, can you talk a little bit more about how we list out all the components when at different situations, like the designers have different opinions, how you consolve that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my goal is I want this thing to be owned by everyone on the design team, and the design technologists are sort of there as facilitators and translators of that intent into all the different platforms. And I think the thing that I want us to be able to do is if there's a design that needs to be built for the system, like let's get everyone in a room to sort of figure out what do we need out of it? What are sort of the constraints that you're seeing in your product design? And like, let's understand how we can design for other product designers, basically. And I want it to be a really collaborative process, for sure.
Thanks for taking on so many questions.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised. I didn't know everyone had so many questions.
Okay, is any source code available? Is it anything open source? If not DoorDash's, anyone else's?
So one thing that I want to do is I definitely want to open source our web repo because it's the most mature so far. I think for one thing that's really great about sort of the design systems community is there is a lot of sharing of knowledge around how do you actually build a system, what is the actual code around it. There's a lot of open source like design systems out there. For instance, I would say some of the highest quality ones, Atlassian's design system is incredibly well engineered and has a lot of really good documentation that you can sort of steal from. I've stolen a lot from them, I think. And there's design systems from Segment. I think it's called Evergreen. It's really great, a great place to learn. And there are just a lot of like interesting ones that you can learn from out there, for sure. And we want to open source ours eventually as well. Oh, we have another.
Well, great. I'm actually just kind of curious on the mechanics of how that repo works. So you have this design system repo, you're committing to it. Are you like publishing it to an internal NPM, like a private NPM thing? And
yeah, so basically our web repo is set up as a mono repo of a bunch of different individual packages. So every component that we have is itself a package. And the reason why we do that is we want, we want every team to be able to adopt like changes to those components when it makes sense for them. And so the way that it works is we use Lerna to like publish all of these packages in the mono repo to our internal like NPM, it's a private NPM, and then all of our web projects just pull from there. Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you so much. That's great. So in the remaining few minutes that we have together, let's take this opportunity to connect with 3 other people that you haven't talked to yet, okay? And this time, share with your new friends what you'll do differently, or what you'll do anew or stop doing as a result of having heard this presentation, or maybe just reflecting on what's going on in your own company. And you can exchange contact information. And I think we are here until 8 o'clock, and then we're all exiting. So anyway, thanks for coming. And I'll be sending you guys a survey maybe tomorrow to get feedback. I really appreciate you taking the time, and just take the next several minutes here just to connect with others. Thank you.